Tonight on Nation and Nation, with an Ontario election campaign in full swing, Premier Doug Ford is pushing energy and critical minerals projects, but not so fast, says the Chiefs of Ontario.
If additional resources are to be extracted from the lands that are, territorial lands of our people in Ontario, we need to be at the table.
Trump tariff threats means Canadian energy producers are scrambling to look for other markets. But the head of one First Nations resource organization blames the Liberals for current energy woes.
Everything that Trudeau has done in the last 8 years has only, contributed to the problems that the industry has right now.
Howard Sabres says despite a commitment to move away from solitary confinement, the practice is alive and well in federal prisons.
People are not getting out of cell. People are not, it's not for as short a period of time as possible. It's not clearly not used as a last resort.
Welcome to Nation and Nation. I'm Fraser Needham. U.S. President Donald Trump continues to threaten Canada with tariffs and annexation if the government does not crack down on alleged illegal flow of migrants and drugs across the border. Earlier this week, the White House said it will place a 25% tax on Canadian steel and aluminum exports, effective March 12th. Chiefs of Ontario has been one of the First Nations organizations speaking out against the Trump threats. Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief for Ontario, Abram Bennett, joins me today. Welcome back to Nation to Nation.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about in your former role as the district chief of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, where of course your community straddles the U.S.-Canada border and has had some problems with human trafficking. Do you think some of the recent moves by the federal government to sort of tighten the border and appoint borders czar, I guess, or fentanyl czar and border czar, are they a good thing?
Well, I want to be clear that in Akwesasne and all of our communities across Turtle Island and in our region, community safety is extremely important to us. We want to make sure that the folks that are coming into our community are good people and they don't bring threats to us. So I can assure you that communities along the international line between Canada and the United States feel the same. So border security is extremely important to us, as it is to the Americans and to the Canadians.
Okay, so you think that is Canada moving in the right direction with having some stricter, actually putting some more resources into that? Is that a good thing?
Mm-hmm. Well, I will say that as the former role, as you mentioned, as a district chief, but also as the Grand Chief of Akwesasne, over the years, the federal government of Canada has put significant resources into increasing border security. And so supporting that either through the CBSA or through the Akwesasne Police Services, the RCMP. And so a lot of that work has actually been happening for quite some time. It's just not something that's been broadly known. And so that's one thing, the strategy. Canada has made additional investments, but also has made it very known that they have made investments into border security and made it very visible. Previously, technology has been helping support border security for a long time, and people are just more aware of it now because the Americans have made innuendos that Canada's causing issues and allowing people to cross border. Being the former Grand Chief of Akwesasne, I can assure you that border security has always been important to our nation, but also has been the government of Canada has been concentrated on this.
Okay, and I want to move to something else, but focuses on that area as well. And of course, that's the Jay Treaty, which both Native Americans and then First Nations on this side of the border exercise. Of course, with the tightening of the border and more security on the U.S. side for sure, have you noticed any problems, or have you received any complaints about people not being able to, or First Nations not being able to exercise their Jay Treaty rights?
Absolutely. Through the Chiefs of Ontario, the work that we do, we're supporting the Jay Treaty Border Alliance work, which is a number of communities that are part of that organize to lobby Canada and the United States around the Jay Treaty and protecting and preserving those rights or enhancing them. And so over the last couple months, we have the Americans have been focused more on where people have been born, and so our folks, unfortunately, have not been have been subject to that as well. And that means that, the United States Customs is asking more questions of people entering into their country who are not Americans. And so in the case of the Jade Treaty, the United States does recognize the, provisions of the Jade Treaty that acknowledges, First Nations person born in Canada has the right of entry into the United States. Now, that's not just carte blanche, because the legislation does say 51% of the First Nations blood or American Indian blood, and so they've been asking additional questions to verify that, and which is been a bit upsetting to some of our members. But the legislation has always been there, and so the actions by United States Customs is just more increased because of the scrutiny that's happening. And so we're working with our communities and the United States Customs to mitigate some of those concerns.
Okay. So I wanted to just move quickly to the, of course, there's been a lot of talk about Canada exercising its sovereignty as an energy leader. There's been a lot of discussion that means sort of, pushing ahead on oil pipelines, exploitation of critical minerals, et cetera. Most of these, of course, or a lot of them anyway, sit on First Nations land. What do you think? Is there a problem for First Nations there with sort of all of a sudden this real focus on people saying we should fast track these projects?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we've made it very clear that, as you mentioned, a lot of these resources are in our communities, either under arrangement or not. Most are covered under treaty, and whether or not there's modern agreements for the collaboration or extraction is different in various parts of our region. But I have reached out to the Premier's office. Unfortunately, they're prorogued, well, not prorogued, but they're in caretaker mode in Ontario as well, because they've chosen to go to election. But regardless, we've reached out to them to say, look, we want to support Ontario's position and Canada's position that these tariffs are a terrible thing. But in response to that, we need to be included in those conversations that are happening, because there's no doubt that if additional resources are to be extracted from the lands that are territorial lands of our people in Ontario, we need to be at the table. And so we're pushing hard on the Ontario government. Once they come back to doing business, we'll be definitely sitting at the table with them to make sure we're included.
All right, well, we'll have to end it there, but as always, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity.
Up next, we'll talk to Dale Swampy, the president of the National Coalition of Chiefs, about the potential for First Nations in energy leadership as Canada adjusts to the Trump threats. Welcome back. Donald Trump's continued tariff threats against Canada have sparked a lot of conversations about how this country can increase its sovereignty as an energy leader. Some say this would mean fast-tracking oil pipelines and mining of critical minerals. These projects often sit on First Nations land, though, and would require their consent. Joining me today to talk about it all is Dale Swampy, the president of the National Coalition of Chiefs, an organization that works with industry to involve First Nations in natural resource projects. So welcome back to Nation, Mr. Swampy.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I guess I would start with, in the recent weeks, there has been all this talk about establishing Canada as an energy leader as part of increasing our sovereignty. Where do you think that First Nations may fit into this?
Well, I mean, we're moving forward for the last 7 years since the NCC started to engage in more participation and inclusion in Canada's oil and gas industry, mining, forestry, and so forth. And we continue to do that. We're optimistic about we hope a conservative government comes in, or at least a government that supports more, natural resource development, because we have so many communities now entrenched in the oil and gas industry, as well as the mining industry, precious metals, uranium, everything in terms of natural resources is, in my opinion, in our opinion, booming. And First Nation leaders are the ones that want to participate in this and be a part of the prosperity that exists in the upcoming natural resource boom. So we're excited about it. Now,
of course, this has started talks about that the need fast track some oil pipeline projects and critical mineral projects, other resource projects to sort of establish Canada's sovereignty in energy, and they simply can't have any delays on these projects any longer. Do you think, is that an accurate assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean, with the threat of large tariffs against, natural resource-backed and funded industries, it's become clear that everything that Trudeau has done in the last 8 years has only, contributed to the problems that the industry has right now. We don't have access to, tidal water access to for our natural resources, and that's hurting us. 99% of our oil and gas goes to United States, and it's going to cripple us if this tariff does come through. And as a marginal sector of the society within Canada, First Nations are going to be impacted the most. And that means that oil and gas companies, natural resource companies, production companies, they're all going to look for, more leeway, more opportunities to cut their taxations from the government, cut their, royalties that they give to the government in order to survive. And the government's gonna allow that. And what happens when the government gets reduced to income? The marginal funding programs get cut off, and we are part of that. We're a marginal community that's going to have less access to funding. Even the lawsuits that were settled by Trudeau, they may become, under there may be a concern that the funding for that won't be available. So this tariff thing has a real impact across the board, and we're starting to realize this, and we're starting to, worry about this activity. And we've seen it right now in a lot of the industries, both in mining and oil and gas, that people are not doing anything right now. They're sitting on their hands waiting to see what really happens. They're not spending any money. Nobody's going out there and announcing capex for 2025 yet, because they're waiting until the tariffs are, wound out. And if that happens, there's going to be a less capital investment across the country, and less capital investments means, more subsidies from the government, more help from the government to get our industries back on track, and less transfer payments. So it's gonna hit Quebec hard. It's gonna hit First Nations hard. So we're worried about it, and we're glad to see the AFN is out in Washington today, doing something about it. And I think that's important. The American Indians in the United States have, a lot of influence, a lot of lobbyists in their corner. But the AFN right now, we don't see that within Canada, because Canada doesn't even allow us to register as lobbyists.
Right, and I guess, do you think that as part of this too, there's been a real big change in the discussion that everything sort of has to be on the table again, perhaps even like the Energy East pipeline that was abandoned, some of these other projects that were even off the table? Do we have to be looking at everything now to get, I guess, energy flowing east to west rather than north-south?
Exactly. I mean, when we're a group that was formulated out of the Northern Gateway project. And we know that if the Northern Gateway was built, we'd be, on track to building expansion, and we'd have access to, world prices, Brent prices, and they'd be much more than what we're getting through the United States. So we know that opportunity is gone. In order for us to, it's going to take at least 4 years to build a pipe like that. If we get approval right away to start going, because we got all the engineers and technicians and oil and gas capacity for construction out here more than any other country in the world. We could build that pipe in no time, but we need a government that's willing to support it. And right now they're just waiting until they find out what Trump's going to do, when in fact it should be a policy that is already there. They should be diversifying their ability to be able to sell their product to more countries than the United States. We should be building these pipes right now, east to west and so forth. But, we've had it good for too long. provinces argue against each other. We got trade barriers between provincial lines. I just don't understand that. We have provinces who won't support other provinces, like Quebec not supporting Alberta. It's not realistic. I mean, the majority of their money transfers comes from Alberta. They should be supporting us. So it's this type of thing that ruins our ability to be able to compete internationally, and we have to get off the pot and start doing something real so we can protect our children's ability to be able to survive in this country economically.
Okay, well, we'll have to end it there. But once again, thanks very much for talking to us today about this very important and timely issue.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, we'll talk to Howard Sapers about a new report that says Canadian prisons continue to use solitary confinement. Welcome back. Since 2019, solitary confinement was supposed to be a thing of the past in federal prisons. This was when Correctional Service Canada was to move to structured intervention units, which are meant to lessen the time inmates spend in cells without human contact. But a new report finds in reality little has changed, and structured intervention units are operating very much like solitary confinement. Howard Sapers is the lead author of the report, and he joins me in studio today. Welcome back to Nation to Nation, although I think it's probably been a while, right?
It's been a while, but thanks for tracking me down.
Right, so one of the things you hear is structured intervention units, but maybe you could just tell our viewers what exactly are those supposed to be?
Okay, well, I'll tell you what they're supposed to be, and then we can talk about what they are. So what they're supposed to be is the replacement for segregation, or what a lot of people call solitary confinement. Back in 2019, two courts of appeal in BC and Ontario, found that the way the Correctional Service was using segregation violated the Charter. And it was around things like segregation could be indefinite. Segregation was disproportionately used for Indigenous prisoners, mentally ill prisoners. There was no independent oversight. Segregation could be prolonged, actually meeting the definition, the international definition of what would be cruel and unusual or torture. So prolonged, indefinite, no oversight, disproportionately affects certain populations. That was all in violation of the Charter. So the government amended the federal law for corrections, the Corrections and Conditional Release Act. They created these new SIUs, Structured Intervention Units, no longer segregation. Structured intervention was to be a last resort. It was to be used for as short a period of time as possible. There has to be guaranteed time out of the cell, 4 hours out of the cell. 2 of those hours have to involve something called meaningful human interaction. Lots of oversight opportunities for review, including newly created statutory independent reviewers and decision makers who would have the legal authority to order people transferred out of those units if CSC was seen to have not complied with those other things, like it should have been the last resort, it should have been for the shortest possible, etc. That's the design. That's the way it was supposed to work.
And I guess in reality, we've heard this before, it's not working at all that way.
Well, the Correctional Service of Canada has now been opened up the first door on one of these units in November of 2019. So they've had lots of time. They did have to get through COVID. Granted, that was a little tough. But since November 2019 to today, what I can say is at best, it's very uneven how the policy has been implemented. And at worst, it's just as bad as it always was. People are not getting out of cell. People are not, it's not for as short a period of time as possible. It's not clearly not used as a last resort. Still disproportionately, we see these restrictions on movement and association. So isolation, these isolating conditions of confinement, we see them disproportionately still being used with Indigenous men and women and mentally disordered men and women.
And of course, there's obviously it's kind of it's still on the lines of solitary confinement, not really maybe adhering to what structured intervention units are supposed to be. But what are some of the I have an idea, but what are some of the real harms that this can do to someone that's in this type of situation?
Well, what we know is, let's look at mentally disordered individuals. What we know, if people are depressed, suicidal, anxious, if they have difficulties in terms of building relationships with others, maintaining relationships, if they have insomnia, a whole host of things from behavioral disorders to cognitive issues to diagnosed major psychiatric illnesses. What we know is that if you put somebody in isolation, you're going to often make those problems worse. So it could be dangerous to their health. Any kind of isolation is contrary to the way that you and I and our family and our friends would want to be. We are social beings. So that's why the law said you have to be out of your cell for at least 4 hours a day. But the way the law is actually written is it says CSC only has to offer time out of the cell. So a correctional officer will knock on your door and say, would you like your yard time now? You may say no. Pardon me. You may say no for great reasons. It could be 8 o'clock in the morning, it could be February, and it could be a blizzard outside. It could also be that if you go to the yard at that particular time, it means you'll miss your spot in line to use the telephone to call home. So people have to make choices. And you're not supposed to choose between complying with the law and things like the entitlement to make a phone call.
Now, have you been able to get any feedback from corrections why they're not following, I guess, this to the at least like not the letter, even the spirit of it?
The courts were concerned that people were locked up in isolation for up to 24 hours a day. International guidance, like the Mandela rules from the United Nations, say you shouldn't be in your cell for more than 20 hours a day. So the idea was to get people out, not just to offer them a chance to get out. So that's what they should be measuring. So part of the problem is, what is success? So the Correctional Service of Canada will also say the count is down. So what that means is, before November 2019, there may have been 300, 400, 500, 600 people on a given day in a segregation cell. Today, there are far fewer SIU cells. There are fewer people in one of those cells on a given day. So CSC will say, look, it must be working because the count's down. But in fact, 2 other things have happened. Number one, more people are cycling through those cells. So in terms of the actual number of people who experience isolating conditions and confinement, it hasn't changed very much. But the other thing that's more troubling is they're what the Correctional Investigator's Office called hidden cells. They're not really hidden, but what they meant by that was these are other places in a prison that aren't SIUs, but where people are held without movement and association. In other words, confined to their cell by themselves, extended periods of time, without being able to associate with others. Those places, which are called various things, don't have the kind of oversight, monitoring, and public reporting that the SIUs do. So, frankly, today, I can't tell you how many people in a federal penitentiary tonight are going to be living in those isolating conditions. Some will be in the SIU, some will be in other places in the institution.
Okay, well, I guess we'll have to leave it there for time purposes, but once again, thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to speak with you.
That concludes this week's episode of Nation to Nation. If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast at aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Fraser Needham. Good night.